To begin, let me introduce Jonathan, hello Colorado, hello Paul in Madison, Paul and Renee in Madison, Bethany and Nancy from Seattle, a whole bunch of paired urbanites. I'm really glad you could all make it. And hello to everybody who's just joined in, like Julie and David. Really glad to see all of you here. So let's begin. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the creator and cat herder, the MC for the Future Trends Forum. And today we're going to be talking about the future of education. And instead of a guest, we're going to have actually myself. And I'll explain why and show you what's special about that. But before we go further, let's just introduce the forum and explain where it comes from, what it does, and who supports it. So to begin with, the Future Trends Forum is the video social spinoff of the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. The FTTE report is a monthly trends analysis that takes a look at current developments in education and technology and uses them to extrapolate forward to where education could be going. It's been going for a little more than 5 years. We track more than 85 trends. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, please go to ftte.us and you can download some sample ones or sign up for the whole thing. Now, a key part of this work, and we just need to emphasize this, is that when we look at the future of education, we'll see this just a few minutes, is that we have to think about it internationally. It's a real mistake to focus in on higher education by only looking at one region or one nation. And we've done this in our research, and you can see it here in the discussions in the forum. This map shows you that we've had discussants and participants from all over the world, from Australia, East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, North and South America, and we hope to have more. Now, before we go further, I need to explain who's been supporting this and who makes all of this possible. And along the way, I'll show you how the technology works. So first, I'd like to thank NYSERNet from New York State. It's a nonprofit that helps connect to the internet a group of colleges, universities, libraries, and museums. And we're grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig because, as you can see, Shindig has made available this technology we're using now. And we're very, very grateful to them for that. So let me just show you how to use it if you're not familiar with it, even if you haven't been here before or if you just need a refresher. This is a video conferencing tool that's profoundly designed for discussion, not so much presentation. So what I'm doing now, me yammering at you with a few PowerPoint slides, that's going to stop really quickly. The key thing is participation, your ability to make comments and ask questions. And within this environment, there are 3 different ways of doing that. So if you direct your eyes to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a white strip at the very bottom that has a series of icons on it. On the second to leftmost is what looks like a dialog box from a cartoon. That's a text box. If you click that, it will pop the text box, and you can chat with around 18 or 19 people who are logged in with you at the same time. So right now, I can take a look, for example, at Renee, Pfeiffer Luckett, Sean, Jonathan, Ryan, Bethany, David, Sarah, Julie, Nancy, Embry, Mary C., Brenda, and a few more. Use that if you'd like to chat, ask questions, share URLs. That's a perfectly good way to participate. Now, next to that in the white strip, you'll see a question mark. If you click that, you can type in a question or a comment. We'll flash it on the screen so that everybody can see it, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. That's a good thing to do if maybe your bandwidth isn't great or you're not in a position where you come on stage. Now, if your mic is working and your camera is working and you're in a position where you can speak, try clicking that raised hand in the middle of that strip. That tells us they want to come join us on stage. We can have about 4 people up here at one time. It's really, really easy to do. So if you haven't done it before, trust me, it's like teleporting in Star Trek. Up you'll come and get a chance to talk. So we'd love to hear from all of you. And today, this is especially available for you to come join us with questions and comments. So use any of those techniques to comment or share questions with you. And believe me, we'd love to hear from you. Now, those are 2 of the entities who support us. I also want to refer to the crowd who supports us. If you go to Patreon, we have dozens of people who contribute every month to keep this work going. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you'll see people who've been contributing as little as $1 a month so that we can keep the lights on, keep the technology humming, and keep the research going. I strongly, really, really appreciate everybody who's contributed there. The Patreon people are very good. And I try to give them as many advance notices and special treats as possible. So please, if you haven't done that before, join it if you can. We'd love to hear your support. Now, that's who makes this possible. And that's the technology. Let's actually get to this subject. What we're going to be doing today is taking a look at the FTTE report and catching you up on some of the developments and some of the major trends. So what I'll be doing is I'll just be speaking to some of these trends. I'll explain how these are broken down in a little while. And along the way, I'd like to ask for your feedback, your questions, your comments, your thoughts. And then as you develop these, we'd like to run with them as far as you can. So just to explain, there are four major headers of trends that we track in FTTE. Now, the first major trend category, the first major trend basket is for education and its contexts. So that includes demographics, that includes sociology, that includes policy, as well as education itself and what changes within it. The second big basket of trends is about technology per se. So we can take a look at everything from mobile to 3D printing to earbuds. We'll come back to that. The third big basket is about education and technology. So we look at everything from learning management system to gaming and education. And there's a fourth basket after that, which is a kind of mega trend box, if you will. And that's where we try and see what happens when we roll a bunch of these trends together into a ball. And we call that basket right now the higher education crisis. So we're going to begin by talking about education and trends. And I don't want to show you any slides because everything that I have is stuff that is going to be available in the next FTTE report that you can find online. And I'd rather have you folks join me on stage for questions and thoughts. Now, to begin with, let's talk about the world around education. There are a few aspects of international education that I think are especially important. One is a recent Pew Research survey looked at the entire globe's attitudes towards certain kinds of pedagogy. And it was very, very interesting. Generally speaking, if you asked participants, do you prefer pedagogy that is about creativity, learner autonomy, and about self-discovery? It tended to be supported by people from developed nations. So from, say, Japan, Europe, the United States. If, on the other hand, you said, would you prefer skills-based learning, where you learn job skills, where education is training, that tended to get more support from the developing world. Now, interestingly, the one country that actually crossed these two streams, that said we want the skills and we want the autonomous learning, was China. That's an interesting thought to think about, to see if they are kind of the synthesis of global education. It's a fascinating report, huge subjects, and it's fun to break it down too. It'd be interesting to apply those questions to, say, a given country, and who within the country adheres to one or the other pedagogy. A second aspect to think of, if we bring the US back into this, is that international applications to undergraduate and graduate education in the United States have, depending on which school we're talking about, either plateaued or declined. Now, this is a very, very important subject. In some ways, it's not surprising. The reason it's important is because American higher education has terrific global standing, sort of leading research universities in the world, but also we depend heavily on the world for international students, in part to keep the student body going, especially as proportion begins to decline. Now, the reason this is not surprising is because of some of the dynamics with Trump, especially the Muslim ban and a few other policies that make the US look more hostile to international students from different nations. Renee, you can join us if you'd like. You can come on back. That was Renee Francois from that search. So let me just ask, when we think about, well, let me come back to that. I just want to get a global setting. There are a few very, very large developments. Let's zero in the US now for some of the bigger trends. Again, we're not in technology yet. We're talking about the big social political forces that shape technology and education. So one of them is when we look at racial access to education or human access to education shaped by race. One of the interesting problems we're finding is that if you break down wealth in the United States, Hispanic and Black families not only have less wealth than white or Asian families, but the amount of wealth they have has been slowly decreasing over the past 10 years, driven in part by the Great Recession. Whereas the wealth that we can find associated with white and Asian families has slowly been increasing. Now, this matters for all kinds of reasons. This helps underpin racist differences, both structural and terms of attitudes. But this also helps explain some of the problems of access of Hispanics and Blacks getting access to education. when the families, generally speaking, seem to be less likely to have the family wealth necessary for, say, securing a loan or simply paying tuition. Also, in the question of racialized education, there are more signs and indicators that we may see more racial strife on campuses. To begin with, the Anti-Defamation League was taking a look at the number of racist flyers that have been left on campuses this fall. Found that number was increasing, and they forecast more and more of this. So that's something grim to anticipate. The second part of this is Middlebury College promulgated some new rules about student speakers. Now, this may sound like a very, very small case. I mean, it's one college out of 4,000, but this is in response to the very high-profile Charles Murray incident from last year, where an outside speaker was met with protests. The protests turned violent. So in response to that, the college has promulgated new rules, which give the administration the ability to suspend a speaker if they think that there was a chance of violence. This is controversial. Some call this institutionalizing the heckler's veto. But it's another sign, just one sign, of this larger trend of campus political and race-based political tension as well. Turning from race to sexual assault, very famously, the Obama administration had a very, very important ruling where they asked colleges and universities across the United States to intensify their approaches towards sexual assault. This has been controversial. Numerous axes. I don't have time to break this down. The key development point here is that the Trump administration undid that request to campuses. So the standards that the Obama administration recommended are no longer supported by the Trump administration. That is obviously very controversial and can have a lot of impact depending on the institution. Related to that, several observers have noted that campus sexual assault cases disproportionately charge and punish black men rather than white or members of other races, which is very problematic for all kinds of reasons. Related to that, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, published a school ranking list, and the criteria for that were based on how they structured due process in sexual assault cases. So as you can see, the sexual assault on campus issue has continued to ramify, become more contested. Now, we covered the question of who's on campus and where enrollment is. And let me just say a few words about that, and then we stop for questions and comments. Now, one key figure is that a survey of admissions officers, so people on campuses who are charged with recruiting student classes, the majority of them in a recent poll said that they had difficulties in reaching the incoming class size targets. So they wanted to reach this far, and they didn't get that far. That was a majority across the United States. Again, this ties into our earlier tracking of total enrollment in higher education ticking down year by year. Now, related to that, more than 1/3 of undergraduates now take classes part-time. So this is part of this general picture, this big sea change that we're watching in higher education. Where American higher education is moving from being a kind of 1940s era of an undergraduate goes to school, they go there for 4 years, it's a residential campus, they're taught by tenured faculty, they graduate 4 years later after a life-changing experience, and they continue to participate in their alma mater for years after. And what we are moving towards instead is a world where the majority of students are adult. We're not quite there yet, but we're coming closer and closer to that. And where the majority of learners work jobs and might not be able to go to campus full time. So that 37% of undergraduates taking classes part-time is a very, very important data point. Now, along with that, if we look at the students who are on campus, when they're on campus, we've received more data about two big trends that I'm sure you all know well, but I just need to keep saying that they continue to work. One is that interest in STEM classes continues to rise, and this rises worldwide. The OECD every year publishes an education survey of the entire planet, and they found that everywhere we went internationally, interest in STEM from K through 12 to graduate school was continuing to rise, from life sciences to coding to engineering. In contrast, the humanities continue to have difficulties. The American Historical Association published new stats showing that the number of students majoring in history is continuing to decline. And in fact, history is having especially a hard time trying to attract students of color, as well as trying to attract women. So taken together, we're seeing this continuous sea change of students shifting towards STEM and away from the humanities. It's a broad change, lots of exceptions to that, but that's a major trend. So let me pause for a second. That's a lot of data to hurl at you in a row. But what do you think about this? We've talked about racial access and inequality. We've talked about the campus sexual assault controversy. We've talked about some international aspects. And we talked about enrollment. Let me just ask, are you seeing signs of that on your campus? Does this match up with your expectation? Where do you think this is going? In order to answer that, again, you can click on the chat box, or you can join us on stage. Jonathan Parts just asked, isn't student debt a huge issue? I think John, hi John, is that you?
Different Jonathan.
Oh, okay, well, you go ahead, you're on stage.
I'm sorry, just some of the themes just really stuck out to me in terms of especially like racial composition of campuses. I went to Purdue University, which, if you're not familiar, it's a massive state school in the Midwest in Indiana, one of the original land-grant institutions. We put Neil Armstrong on the moon. But even despite all these amazing accomplishments, we still have huge issues at that university with racial composition, and race relations, such that a Black Lives Matter rally occurred in response to racial epithets being scrawled across campus, and someone left a sign when they went to go to the bathroom and came back and found their sign was vandalized with even more racial epithets, and that drew a deep investigation into racial composition and then the background. So I think a lot of these campuses, especially in the middle of the country, are struggling to recruit students from these diverse backgrounds. And it's interesting to juxtapose this in the same position as the decline of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that are tremendously struggling to meet their budgets, and a lot of them are declining in their admissions and applications. And Howard University is a good example. I interacted with their president a few years ago, but he's saying that their campus has ironically grown more diverse as a result of its decline in status. So I think that, again, I mean, my theory has always been you have to start from kindergarten and pre-K with your education systems and invest in communities to solve that problem.
Quite true. Where are you based now, Jonathan?
I'm in New York City.
Oh, excellent. Well, these are huge issues, and you're absolutely right. There's already both. First, the question of racial incidents on campus. As I mentioned before, the ADL report and what we've seen so far, it looks like we'll probably see more of these. So, and they're very low budget events. I mean, to scrawl graffiti on somebody's door takes nothing. It can be done anonymously most of the time. And that's awful for trying to assemble.
And that kind of event discourages students of color from joining the campus in the first place. It's self-fulfilling. I think the population is only 4%, and half of that population of Black students were student athletes. So that brings in even larger elements into play.
Sure. Well, they're often segregated on campus by virtue of their athletic schedule, much like student musicians, simply because they have that very technical program to follow. And your second point about HBCUs is quite true. We're seeing this throughout the Midwest, as well as the Southeast, where HBCUs are having problems supporting themselves. These are huge issues, and I'm really glad you brought them up. Thank you. If you want to stick around for a minute on stage, please feel free.
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thanks. We're going to, unless we have any more questions or comments, we're going to keep pushing on. In the chat box, Jonathan Ports asked about debt. We're coming back to debt. I promise you, that's a major issue. And if the rest of you haven't seen this before, having Jonathan from New York up on stage, you can see how easy that it was. So we welcome you there. Well, let's push on a bit to even more trends. So we were just talking about education and access in terms of race. But we should also take a look now in terms of the economy. So FTTE tracks macroeconomic trends pretty closely. And I think it's important to know that we have good news and bad news. So the good news is that according to Bureau of Labor Statistics, from 2015 to 2016, average American income actually increased by 7.2%. In case you're curious, the average American income, according to BLS, is $74,000, $664. So if you're making $74,000, you're smack dab in the average, according to BLS. So this is good news because we've had a hard time having American incomes grow. We also have not so good news. Recent studies of income inequality have argued that we might be understating the degree of income inequality. That is, we think we're really unequal, but in fact we're really unequal. That's because recent research looked into overseas accounts and found that they were larger and harder to assess than before. On top of that, a bunch of you mentioned living in cities, from Seattle to Chicago. One of the major city think tanks found that American city tax revenues have actually declined the past 2 years for the first time since the recession recovery began. And this is obviously bad news for everybody, really. One of the researchers observed, quote, "Cities still haven't recovered from the recession. Their revenues last year reached just under 98% of what they were in 2006. So again, we still have the echoes of the 2008 crash still being felt. Now, we turn to one of my favorite topics, which is demographics. Demographics are fantastic for understanding the future of education, for the future of anything, because population movements tend to be very slow, very stately, and we can get our arms around them and understand them, have a better chance of extrapolating where they're going. Now, here's one key point. Recent stats have showed that Americans are more likely to move house, move across country or wherever, the more educated they are. And this is interesting. This hasn't always been the case. Oftentimes, pretty much we've all been equally likely to migrate across some state borders from city to city. But now the differentiation seems to be that if you're more educated, you're more likely to pick up stakes and move somewhere else. It's important when we think about everything from where students go after they graduate to the students we attract. Now, we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about technology itself. I know for some of you, that's the highlight. So let's dig into this. We cover a whole series of technology trends, and we just pull out a few of them, the most recent data that's interesting. And some stories as well. 3D printing is something we've been tracking for quite some time, and we found a few interesting stories. An Australian company contracted to work in Britain is 3D printing railroad station interiors. So stations, the insides of them, they're printing walls and joists and roofs and floors, which is pretty tremendous. I mean, this follows the general movement of 3D printing buildings. On top of that, at a smaller level, a robotics experiment in China, I'll talk about this in a little bit, managed to successfully 3D print teeth. Now this is becoming more and more standard, I think, in the United States, because 3D printing of teeth lets you customize to the specific shape of the jaw and the needs of the dentist. But it's interesting to see that continue. We're going to come back to that story because it's even bigger in just a minute. Another trend that we've been tracking is digital security. And we should probably rename this digital insecurity at this stage because state of digital security is so terrible. I mean, just over the past couple of months, we've seen the Equifax hack, which freed up hundreds of millions of users. If any of you feel like you were affected by it, please feel free to say so in the chat box. And that was fascinating in part because of the scale, the size of it, which is really, really large, but also the way Equifax handled it, which was pretty badly. If you followed the story, they sat on the hack for months. They didn't patch it correctly. They directed users to an information page, which if you used it, would prohibit you from ever suing Equifax. It's an interesting story, and it's not the only one. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the federal agency in charge of supervising the financial sector, revealed that it was hacked last year, and some private banking information was liberated by hackers. And on top of this, one of the big four accounting firms, Deloitte, itself was hacked. Client email information was lost. And there are more and more examples of this kind of large-scale hacking. Yahoo just announced that their terrible hack from a few years ago was actually bigger than they said. All of their users had their data exposed, which is at this point 1 billion. We found some more stories about people inventing new ways to attack devices. So Princeton computer science team managed to figure out a way to trick Alexa or Google Home. That is, these are speech recognition technologies where you can say, Alexa, do this. The Princeton team managed to come up with subvocal content so that you can manage to quietly, without human hearing, still speak to one of these technologies and get them to obey you, which is a really clever hack. To defend against all of this, another research team invented a new form of biometric scanning, which I don't know if this will go anywhere, but I do want to share it with you. You know, we have the biometrics of thumbprints, which is pretty classic. We also have the iris scanning, which is coming back up. The iPhone just released the idea of facial scanning, which is in 3D, which is pretty interesting. This research team suggested that we actually scan our hearts, the muscle itself, which is interesting if you think of what happens to the heart over time in heart surgery. Anyway, security is a mess. It continues to get worse. You can see this in the chat box where people have just weighed in. Paul B. notes that almost 2 billion data records were exposed in the first half of 2017. Almost 2 billion. We're closing in on a major chunk of the human race. Jonathan, I think from New York, noted the story about Russians finding a method for hacking NATO soldiers' smartphones, which is pretty exciting. John, if you can find the URL for that, I'd love to see it because I haven't had a chance to dive into the story. And Bethany noted this crucial problem with the Internet of Things. And she says, quote, the more devices like 3D printers we add to our networks, the more we increase our digital security challenges. So I think we're all on the same page here that the security situation is bad and is likely to continue to get bad, if not get worse. Now, there are other technologies. We have a lot to cover. One trend I've been tracking for 2 decades is the transition from analog to digital in terms of media. That is how we scan and how we make things natively. One, I think, heartbreaking and kind of sweet story had to do with the revelation that a group of Afghan movie lovers had hidden from the Taliban hundreds and hundreds of cans of movies, celluloid. They're now scanning it, making it available online. It's a tremendous thing to think about. With the ultimate cinema lovers, but also the way that we can use the digital world as a backup from the chaos of the analog. Now, let's move to the mobile device world a little bit. Jonathan, thank you so much for that link. Thank you. The mobile device world continues to expand and ramify. I usually refer to this as the device ecosystem because we no longer have one single device to rule them all. We have many of them, and they overlap and interact. So one part of this is that with augmented reality, Apple released the ArcKit, a developer's kit for augmented reality for iOS devices. And this is getting tremendous amounts of attention. And Apple has just surged into the lead in augmented reality development. So I definitely watch that from the Apple ecosphere. In terms of wearable computing, Google and Levi's just put out a connected circuit-covered jacket for sale, $350. And I haven't had a chance to try it on yet, but it'd be really interesting to see how this works out. Bethany mentions the Google competition to Apple and AR called Arcor. Again, if you think back to the 1990s, the big battles between Microsoft and Apple, and now the big planetary clash of the tech titans in many ways, Google versus Apple. Thank you for sharing that, Bethany. Speaking of wearable computing, there were reports leaked, so take it with a grain of salt, that Amazon is developing glasses connected to its Alexa system. So that is, in theory, if you have Alexa running in your house, you can then experience it through glasses that you're wearing. So you can say, Alexa, play me Clash of the Titans, and they may show in your spectacles. They haven't seen the spectacle specs yet, but this is something to watch for. Now, in terms of mobile, just to keep going, thank you, Jonathan. Another good link on that. We have stats from marketing companies which show that right now, when it comes to media and entertainment content, the biggest technology for consuming them is smartphones. That's the one that's rising. That's where we're getting more and more users. That user consumption of media and entertainment through tablets and through desktops is actually declining. So this might be another data point in our continued shift towards the mobile world. Now, speaking of the mobile world, just a few more points that we need to move on. Samsung announced plans for a foldable smartphone. I would love to see how these can function, but that's an interesting kind of retro idea, back to the flip phone idea, back to the Star Trek communicator. Samsung and Huawei are now the world's two biggest mobile handset makers, surpassing Apple. If we want to get even more experimental, we can talk about graphene-based temporary tattoos. The University of Texas team managed to use these as data gathering for healthcare. So you can take one of these built out of the amazing graphene material, apply it to your skin as a temporary tattoo, and it'll get information about your blood cells, about your pulse, about your respiration, and so on. And you can peel it away, which is a fascinating new tool. Meanwhile, Microsoft did a whole series of things. Just to step back, Microsoft they've been using the term mixed reality, and the term has become very popular. This is where you combine augmented reality and virtual reality into a synthetic experience. And now what they're arguing is for two major uses. One is for automotive use, excuse me. So that if you're trying to build a car, repair a car, or work on a car, that having the HoloLens or any of the other headsets would be a good way of doing it. They're also saying that their mixed reality tool is good for collaboration. This is an important point, because virtual reality is often asocial. It's really all-consuming. It's very immersive. It's very hard to contact other people. We know Facebook is working on some form of social VR, but it's years away. Microsoft is arguing that mixed reality is actually a way to have good collaboration. Keep an eye on that. Now we come to social media, but before we go to social media, let's stay social and say hello to Patrice. Hello, Patrice. Can you see us? Can you hear us? Okay, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it yet. We'll try again, Patrice. It'll be good to see you from New York. Okay, she's trying again. I need to have some dramatic music right now. Dun, dun, dun. Ah, it didn't work out. Could be a bad with this show. One more point about mobile. We take a look at social media, and one of the things is that we know that people tend to access social media through mobile devices. You can access social media through anything, but mobile devices tend to be very popular. Right now, according to Pew Research Center, a growing proportion of Americans get their news through social media. And that is actually a very interesting number. It used to be that you could focus mostly on young people doing this, but now we have expanding numbers of seniors. And interestingly, a growing number of people without a college degree, and for the first time, racially, non-whites are now more likely than whites to get news on social media. Really interesting shit to think about. So, one last major point to address with technology, both life and education, which is automation. And automation continues to surge forward. Let me just share a few stories about AI and robotics. First, Microsoft is using their new tool called Pendleton to help with data cleanup, HR, natural language interface development. Slack is looking at using AI to help users manage information overload. UMass Amherst team launched an AI that tracks police shootings. Another project trained a neural network to guess a person's sexual identity based on photographs and was more accurate in those guesses than humans were. Meanwhile, on the side of robots, we're seeing a whole variety of developments that don't get a lot of attention. British university team raised an entire crop of barley from seed to harvest without any humans being involved in the field. A whole set of robots actually did this. Quote, no human set foot in the field between planting and harvest. Everything was done by robots. Now, in the US, a burger restaurant chain with about 30 stores set up where all the cooking was done by robots. And meanwhile, in the US, because 4 different projects are developing them right now and using them on the roads, the West Coast and the East Coast. And Switzerland, the Swiss government allowed a drone delivery service, Matternet, to begin operations over densely populated areas. So you put a drone station basically in your house, and the drone can deliver goods and products for it. So that's a lot going on with automation, and we have more to talk about, but we need to dive into education. Let me just ask, before we get into education, are there any major technology developments that you think we should be thinking about? Are there any new gadgets, any new software, any new practices, any new problems about technology that we haven't been paying attention to that we really need to? So again, use the chat box where Bethany and Jonathan are having a blast. Click the raised hand, or click the join podium if you want to come up and join us on stage. Or just type in a question into the little question mark box, and we can read it out loud and show to everybody else. One person is, Bethany mentions new VR things. Bethany, which things are you interested in? Which ones are really catching your eye? And you can either type in the chat box and I'll read it, or you can join us upstage, or whichever you like. Second life replacements. And by the way, if you want to join us on stage, you should be able to see this kind of teal colored box that says join podium. Just click that, it puts you over on stage just like that. Well, Bethany, one of the fascinating things about VR is that it lets us try to makes the virtual world a lot more compelling in quite a few ways. Jonathan came with a really, really important part. Quantum computing is coming soon. This is Jonathan Barnes. In fact, Jonathan, I don't know if you've seen this, but Microsoft just released a programming language designed for quantum computing. So again, we're still in early days of that, but this is a huge deal once it comes up. You're absolutely right. Brian Gardner says that data analytics and business intelligence seems to be reaching its teenage years. Take it by that you mean data analytics and business intelligence is driving while drunk, shooting up things, getting pregnant, passing diseases, brawling, fighting. That really seems to be. It really seems to be. Unless you have a different view and I'm being too dark. Jonathan mentions that China has been investing heavily in quantum computing, quite so, as well as AI. The whole technology field is pretty vast. Last week, we spent the entire hour just looking at mobile for education. Well, let's take a look at education itself. We just mentioned a couple of major things, and then, Patrice, great. Patrice mentions the number of STEM students is on the rise. Do you have any demographic information? If that is the number, who are enrolling versus completing? How can we help all STEM students thrive? The OECD report was pretty meticulously detailed. That's their education at a glance, and I recommend diving into it. It's a 450-page report. So they can break that down by nation. I think they have breakdowns within nations as well, by age and gender. I think you can take a look at that. For enrolling versus completing, there's still some serious melt. I haven't seen any discussion about the change of that curve. And how do we help STEM students thrive? This is a huge question. In part, we have all these approaches for helping students in general thrive, but also we have to think about STEM-specific ways. I think in the US, a key part of that is really reaching out to women and Blacks and Hispanics to help them thrive, given that they usually under-enroll proportionally. That's a major, major question. Patrice, I think you're at Cornell. If there's anything going on at Cornell that you think is really successful, please let us know and share that, because that's a great school for science. Thank you, Patrice. Let's dive into education and technology. We know that the amount of online learning continues to grow, if you measure it by students taking online classes. However, we have some countervailing trend, which is that the United States Inspector General, the Education Department's Inspector General, ruled that the Western Governors University was not actually an online learning class or an online learning enterprise. They deemed that they were, in fact, a correspondence school. And the way they made it, there were a couple of key decision points. One was, in their view, in their assessment, the students didn't have frequent interaction with each other and with faculty, that they had, say, weekly interactions. And for them, that's like getting a syllabus or getting class materials in the mail. So, a correspondence school, not like an actual replacement for a bricks and mortar campus experience. So no one thinks that the Trump administration is going to follow up with that. They might, but this is mostly a leftover assessment from the Obama administration, but it's still a very important counter. It makes us think in many ways how to improve online learning to make it more continuous and more present. In the learning management field, there's been some interesting developments that are kind of cloudy. One is that the Google Classroom project hasn't really competed with the rest of the LMS world. It's interesting. I mean, Google Classroom has a lot of LMS features, but people aren't really adopting it for that. It's not replacing Canvas or Blackboard. Another interesting point is that we had a frantic online discussion trying to figure out how big the educational technology market was. Michael Feldstein roughly figures it's about $2 billion, but it was fun trying to explore how big this actually was. Now, if we think about, in many ways, the opposite of the elements, if we think about social media and learning, there's been some more developments, but they're in many ways pretty typical developments. There have been more stories about faculty who've gotten into trouble for things they have shared online. We had a John Jay College adjunct who got in a lot of trouble, including administrative leave, for tweeting about looking forward to teaching police officers who will soon be dead. And Pomona College out in California was a story about a private Facebook page that was allowing students to share racist memes. These are not new trends. These have been going on for a while, so they're worth seeing. At the same time, Snap, formerly Snapchat, has just introduced an interesting project where they were helping students and campus organizations publish stories through Snapchat. So you can think of them as entering the space of, say, the college newspaper or the college radio station. Yeah, Brian Gardner shares this story. I'm pretty suspicious of that number. 252 billion is pretty vast. I'd really like to see that fleshed out. But it may be that we're in line for a huge boom. Thank you for sharing that. Now, we've been talking about open education for a while. I'm sorry. Roxanne Riskin mentions, she says, I'm wondering about the continued online education surge. Will it be more of a movement to a standards developed structure? That's a great question. Depends in part on the standards. Because we have some common cartridge standards that go back a ways. So we have some of that. And there's some interest in moving to other standards, like, say, universal design for learning. So there's some interest in that. Problem is, those are harder to scale and take more resources to implement. I hope so. I hope we'll see more of that, Roxanne. Well, what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to give you guys a chance to stop listening to me for a few minutes. What I'd like you to do is to meet in small groups, pairs, groups of 3 or 4. And I'd like you to think about all these trends that we've just mentioned so far. The trends that I've mentioned, the stories I've mentioned, but also the questions that have been shared by people like Brian and Roxanne and Jonathan, just to think of, and Patrice, to think about which of these you're seeing in your own work right now. So at your college, your university, your library, your museum, where are you seeing this? And are any one of these really standing out? So, for example, cybersecurity, a major issue for students on your campus. Is the LMS being fraught with possibility right now? And are you thinking of moving to a new next generation digital learning environment? Or are you seeing the campus really working on trying to reach out to populations that really hasn't succeeded in connecting with in the past? So let's just take 5 minutes right now and let's just dive into these trends in our worlds, in our practice, and see what you think. See which of these is really connecting with you. In 5 minutes, we'll reconnect, report back out. Now, if you haven't done this before, it's really, really easy to do. If you look at the screen, you'll see a whole bunch of different icons. Some of them are a person, some of them are photographs, some of them are silhouette. Each one represents a sign in from somewhere on the face of the earth. Find someone that's interesting, double click on them, and if they want to talk to you, your 2 icons will click together like Legos. You have your own private audiovisual bubble, which is very handy. Now, if you don't want to speak to someone right now for this 5 minutes, I understand for whatever reason, your bandwidth is bad, or you have a face full of food, or you're in a public place, that's okay. Just go down to the bottom right corner of the screen. There's a little lock icon. Click that, and no one can bother you, no one can talk to you unless you let them in. Okay? Let's just take 5 minutes, and as we say, let's mingle, and then we'll come back. Well, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. I had a really, really great conversation with a man with the splendid name of Brian. Just a person you can't go wrong with. And I just wanted to share a couple of notes from there. But as I start doing that, let me ask you, what did you all discover? What did you find? Which of these trends are the ones that are really having the biggest impact on your institution? So if you could, just put that in the text box, in the chat box rather, or click ask to just fling it up for us and text her. Join us up on stage. Brian told me a really, really interesting thing, technology that we didn't mention, which is that he saw that most of his faculty were most keenly interested in video conferencing, which we're committed to, obviously. But it was really interesting. He was saying that it was very important for having students and faculty access experts as well as alumni elsewhere on the planet, and how exciting that was. And also now, frankly, how easy it was, how easy to connect with people. So that was a really good point, and I'm really glad Brian brought that up. What about you? What else did you guys find? What are the other trends that really stood out for you? And Brian, by the way, I'm sorry I lost you at the very last minute. I tried a fancy trick with Shindig, and it kind of worked, but it cut me loose from you. I'm sorry. Now, if you guys don't have anything to add to this, if you're stymied by the great thoughts of each other, I have a couple more things to add from the final megatrends. Paul B mentions, did you see the news coming out of the Air Forces of late? Racial slurs were scarred the doors of 5 black candidates at the Air Force Academy's prep school. Did General J. Silvera's response, was he the one who was really strongly anti-racist? I heard about it, but didn't need to dive into it. I'm reading this out loud from Paul. Again, this is when you click the question mark at the bottom of the screen of the text page at the top. While Paul is thinking about that, and while you guys are possibly thinking about that, in the chat box, Vanessa Vale mentions 2 very, very important trends. One is augmented reality. Again, that's one that we track. It's a really important one. The other is mobile for rural access. And so that is for people in the country who have a hard time getting broadband, turning to mobile devices to get something better. That's a really important part. Vanessa, by the way, I'm fighting to get that included in the New Horizon report. We'll see if that works. All right. Well, I'm conscious of time, and I want to quickly hit a couple of the last points that are coming up from the new FTTE report. And let me just mention these very, very briefly. When we take a lot of these trends and we wrap them together into a large package, there are a few trends that are coming out that we call, in place of the header, the higher education bubble, or the higher education crisis. And one of them is that student debt continues to grow, simply put. That we have many, many states and some cities that are experimenting with free college or supported tuition. New York State, for example, their Excelsior Scholarship has just had 70,000 students or so taking it. But the debt and indebtedness continues to grow. The Business Insider thought that the United States had the highest average tuition, both public and private colleges throughout the OECD. We also have some questions having to do with enrollment shortfalls. Oberlin College, for example, one of the leading liberal arts institutions in the world, had a serious enrollment drop this year, which is incurring a financial shortfall. On a much more serious note, some of you know from my blog, I've been tracking institutions that are cutting back faculty, programs, non-teaching staff. In fact, 2 schools I've looked at in the past 2 months are closing simply because enrollment is dropping. And these are what we call tuition-dependent institutions. So those are very, very dark as something to worry about. We've also had some interesting politics that swirl around this. So sometimes the politics of higher education is bipartisan, sometimes it's clearly partisan. So for example, we had the Kentucky governor say that students should really tend to take certain programs that get money back. So they should try for something like petroleum engineering or other STEM fields, and they should try to avoid the humanities. That's a typical, we've heard this from other people before, including President Obama once. We're also seeing the Department of Education under the Trump administration trying to, well, basically, among other things, mentioned retracting the Obama administration's dear colleague letter about sexual harassment. But they also cut off a student loan watchdog group from the Consumer Affairs Bureau, which could have helped protect some students. And lastly, but not least, we've seen a bunch of Obama administration officials, former Obama administration officials, form a legal group in order to challenge the DeVos department. So one trend that we seem to be seeing accelerating is partisan argument and partisan contesting over higher education. Now, there are a lot more to look at. There are quite a few more trends, quite a few more ideas. But I want to make sure that you guys got first dibs on this most recent data. And I really wanted to make sure that we get your thoughts back. Looking ahead, looking at the next year, do any of these trends seem especially likely to shape things? That is, are you seeing higher education especially marked by, say, a move to mobile devices, or by emphasis on racial justice, or on even certain issues in research? For example, there's a year ago, there was a famous study which showed that the majority of psychology papers, the majority of psychology research, published research, peer-reviewed research in psychology, could not be reproduced. There was some terrible flaw in psychology as we know it. And we continue to have psychologists, academic psychologists, argue about what this means, just what kind of trouble field is in. Are there any other stories like that that you think are most likely to have an impact on higher education? And if you can't think of one, that's okay. There's a lot to consider. Paul B. in the chat just shared a couple of really good links. Thank you, Paul. And Julie mentions a really, really good point. And Brian Gardner chimes in. These are both about mobile learning. Julie says, higher ed is slow to move forward with technology. But the trend of designing online training for mobile is a big initiative. It's a great point, Julie. Remember that point about the data point about media and entertainment heading more for mobile than anything else? Maybe education is catching up with that. And Brian Gardner uses this great phrase of education anywhere. So wherever we go, we can pull down content and share it. Well, speaking of anywhere, we have to think about any when, which is next week. And next week at the Future Trends Forum, we have a spectacular guest, one of the few people on Earth who can speak more quickly than me. This is Robin Hanson, who is speaking with the Future Automation. If you don't know him, he's a striking figure. He's an economist at George Mason University, but he has deep expertise in technology. In fact, he's worked at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University on precisely that nexus. He has a recent book about what he calls EMS, that is software and hardware that emulate humans. And he imagines a world where those emulations become the dominant life form. And he has a new book coming out in just a few months about how humans actually interact with each other. I've rarely seen anybody who can have so many ideas per minute, speaking so effectively. I really recommend just coming back next week. You'll really have a blast. And if that's not enough for you to do, our book club now has its new book, and you are hearing it before anybody else. So our book club is using the book from Kathy O'Neill, with the best title of any book in the 21st century, Weapons of Math Destruction. Kathy O'Neill is a data scientist. She did a lot of work in hedge funds and is now one of the world's leading critics of automation and AI for policy. This book is a very careful, widely cited, very accessible deconstruction of just how many things can go wrong with using data and algorithms. I can't wait to start reading it. I'm really looking forward to it. I think you will too. Now, we're over the hour, so I've got to say, that's next week, and that's our next reading. If you'd like to find out more about us, there are all kinds of ways. You can go to shindig.com to find out more about this technology, go to FTTE.us to find out more about the Future Trends of Technology and Education report. And you can always find me, Brian Alexander, at Twitter or on the blogosphere. Until then, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.